Thank you again, Laura Beth, for coming, and thank you both. And now let's go on to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that introduction. Thank you so much for being here. I mean, what's better than a Saturday at the library speaking to a debut author? Like, I'm so excited. All right, if you can introduce, I know she did, but it's DéLana.
Yes.
Okay, just making sure I'm getting it correct. I want you, because I'm gonna assume these readers have not read this book, so I'm not gonna give spoilers today. But can you give your best blurb of this book so that they have an idea of what we're talking about before we dive in?
Sure. Redwood Court is an intergenerational coming of age story about a Black family in Columbia, South Carolina, told through the eyes of its youngest family member, Mika, as she comes of age in the 1990s.
But we don't just get Mika's perspective.
Because of intergenerational.
Yes, the intergenerational comes in. So you start this book off with sort of a who's who and how they relate. Why did you want to give us that list of characters and relationships right at the beginning?
Kind of as a reading guide, there's sometimes that I feel as a reader, right? Like I enter into a book in a book world and I'm constantly like making notes about who's related to who was where. And I wanted to just offer that up to the readers at the front. And, you know, in addition to sort of like their relationship to each other, there's birth years, which really situates folks along the timeline, which I think impacts who they are at the convergence of the end of the 20th century.
Why did you choose Mika as your voice for this book? For your main voice, I'll say.
Right, yeah, because it's all the multiple point of views.
Right. It's several, I mean,
Yeah.
which I appreciated the guide at the beginning.
Yeah.
So why Mika?
I think children for adult fiction can be really great interlocutors for multiple generations, right? So she has at her disposal her parents and her grandparents, her maternal grandparents, her paternal grandmother kind of pops in and out. Excuse me, but you know, like children are often invisible, and so Mika gets to be the listener in on many things, and because of her natural inclination to chronicle lives, even her own, right? Like we get to see as unfiltered as possible when it's totally with eyes, right? She's not quite yet understanding everything that's happening. You get to see, I think, a little bit more without it being filtered through an adult's voice.
I liked the scene when she goes into the barbecue and it's like she's not even there. And she's the eyes and ears of that party, but it's like she can just float from room to room. Okay, so let's go back a minute because Mika's your voice, but you then have to switch back pretty far in history. So how do you keep track of all of this as you're writing? Do you write it chapter by chapter? Do you sort of write the storyline and the history first?
So I consider, thank you so much. I consider Redwood Court to be a novel stories.
Okay.
And the first story that I wrote was actually right smack dab in the middle of this book called The 32nd Annual Children's Strut, which really was kind of my initial thinking about starting the world for this project, which is there only one type of coming of age story, right? And we have age, you know, primarily to be a young person going into adulthood. But it's really about a transformation of the person, right? And I was thinking about the journey of Mika, and I mean, I know you don't call this a spoiler, I don't think this is a spoiler. But I'm thinking of the journey of Mika and her grandmother Reese right after they have both lost the most important person in their life, which is Tita, right? Tita is Reese's husband and Mika's grandfather. And like what it must have also meant for Reese to transform her life, right? As a widow, and is that, and like, my first question was, is there a term for, like, is that a second coming of age, right? Like, and can we track both of them at the same time? So that was my initial, like, impulse. And my first kind of initiating stories, they are kind of at the beginning of their journey together, looking at each other like it's just us now. And they go on this trip, which is also about extended family and blood family or not blood family. And I kind of expanded the world forwards and backwards from that story.
Well, I love that you opened my eyes because I'd always considered a coming of age, the adolescent to adult. And for me now, I don't know that I'll ever classify it the same way again, because you can come of age at lots of different times in your life. I just thought it was a fascinating concept. But Mika's an interesting character because she's given a project right at the beginning of the book, and she has to do a report on her family, except in her family, there's not a lot of documentation.
Right.
And so she has to become the documenter. Do you relate to this in some, I mean, like,
It was an exact assignment.
tell us about it.
I need to read the story.
Do it.
Or it's not really a story, it's really like the prologue to Redwood Court.
But it sets it up beautifully.
Yeah, this is called Stories Everyone Knows and Tells. My grandpa Tita says I am the second and last daughter of Rena, who was the only daughter of Lizzie, who was the first daughter of Lady, who was the secret daughter of Big Sis, who was born to Sarah, who came from Ezra, the adopted daughter of Ruth, who adopted her because Ezra was a slave and sold without her mama. But the story was Ezra's mama had 13 children, depending on who asked and depending on if you counted those unborn or born dead. Ruth had 5 children, 3 blood and 2 like Ezra. Tita says when we go back that far, it's hard to know who or what is what. That far back, and it's not a matter of blood relations so much as a matter of who brought up who protected who survived with who. I am writing all of this down. I tell him I have to draw a diagram for my family, for my history project, and bring an artifact, one that traces my history all the way back to whatever country we immigrated from to come live in the United States. I know we didn't immigrate like that is on our own free will, but I ask him if he knows what countries at least we go back to. Baby, the way I see it, I don't know if us Negroes get to answer that question in this life, he said, pulling the cigarette from the corner of his mouth. I feel a way about his use of Negroes because I thought the right term was African American. That's what I've been taught to use. Tita says ain't nothing African about him, but maybe his skin, the way they see him. To me, Negro sounds too close to the N-word, but he says it's clear to him to define himself this way. Folks saying Black these days and meaning not always American. He takes a sip of Sanka coffee I fixed just right, just like he taught me. Hot water, 2 sugars, and 3 scoops of the bitter powder. How far back do you know we go, I asked. Jenny, who knows she's Irish American, showed the class the family Bible where her blood relatives were documented back to the 1600s. Tucker, Dutch American, brought his grandmother's doll with tiny wooden shoes, holding flowers that looked like teacups on the stems, tulips. Next week, I'm supposed to present whatever I bring to represent the country of my origin. I had asked Daddy to help me first, but he won't no real help. Told me to just make a cowboy doll, since he knows for sure he was born in Texas, what his birth certificate says. That country, if they ask, is America, he goes. I roll my eyes at his answer, but I also understand it's the only one he has. I came to Tita to see what he knows. We go back to Georgia for your grandma Weezy's side, I guess. And for you, sometimes I like to think we emerge from the earth like Adam, how we're supposed to go back. Don't you want to know more where we come from, where we're going? I ask him. He squints at me how he does when he knows I'll be on a list of questions he can't answer. Tita shrugs and says he don't know if he wants to know more. What I know about who on this side of the ocean suffered what they did so I could live the life I got is good enough for me. Waving somebody else's flag ain't gonna give me more purpose than the one I got waved in the wars I fought. He pushed himself up a bit on the couch, but doesn't sit upright fully. How I see it, I either wallow in the unknowns that I ain't never gonna know, or I rest knowing my peoples over in Green Sea, South Carolina is made of salt water and collards and oak smoked ham. What am I made of? That's not quite the question for the project, but it has arrived in my heart. How do I know what I am made of? I asked Tita if we have something written down anywhere, or if there was something I could bring in to satisfy the impossible for me assignment. What does it feel like to have a thing or things, like our own stories and books and whatever, to hold our histories that future generations can reference? Tita, how do you think future generations will know the lives we lived? He sucked so hard on his cigarette, you'd think he was pulling tobacco through it to the back of his throat. Baby, that's your assignment, I guess. You, the future generation, he says. He leans his head back over the arm of the sofa, like how I watched a baby bird at my window calling for his mama, and puffs out O's into the still air of the den. Whoever come after you, if that's your plan, that's the future. And whoever after that too the future. But Tita, who will tell them who we are? I'm thinking about how Missy has a book she could bring to class that is as big as a Britannica's in Uncle Junior's room. Miss Hunter showed us a book that was published and is sitting in the main branch library where her great-great-grandfather and all of the things and people he owned is listed. What about us? I didn't realize my voice raised so high at the end of my question. Daddy's cowboy doll compromise meant I was coming to class saying I was just an American, nothing more. Nothing like my classmates who were American, but also descendants of folks who chose to leave their known countries to be here. Tita didn't seem to understand me when I told him bringing a handmade doll was not the same as having something that people who lived years ago had touched and saved and put away and moved from country to country to house to house to house until Timmy could bring it to class. And by that point, after all those generations and years and hands, it would be an artifact. That folks already had historical artifacts to bring in from home, that no one was making a thing to pack into their backpack. He shrugged again. Someone made whatever it is them kids is bringing in at some point to be passed down. I am worried if I don't pass this assignment, I'll ruin my perfect grade in history and, like how everyone warns me, my chance at college, because it'll be on my permanent record. And if I'm to be the first off to college, I have to pass every single class. But this hurdle, the ocean between what's asked of me and what I can answer. Baby, sure, you got this project, do it. Make a family tree branch or whatever. The lines I just told you about. I trust whatever you submit will be fine like it always is. But I guess I'm saying maybe there's a bigger something to go after that will never be finished, that you'll make and make and make again and make some more since you asking all these questions. You know, you sit at our feet all these hours and days hearing us tell our tales. You have all these stories inside you. That's what we have to pass on. All the stories everyone in our family knows and all the stories everyone in our family tells. You have the stories you've heard and the ones you've yet to hear. That's a gift that gives and gives and gives. You get to make it into something for tomorrow. You write it in your books and show everyone who we are.
Okay, but I did request that.
It's hard, no,
I love it. It's so good. Okay, so this happened to you in real life in fourth grade.
Yes.
Okay, and Tita says saltwater color greens. So Tam, what did you say you were made of in fourth grade?
So all of those things didn't happen, but the assignment did happen.
Okay.
And my father did, yes, say naked cowboy doll. And that was all I had, right? Like as a descendant of the institution of American slavery, I did not have a thing.
So what did you do?
I brought in a cowboy doll to my protest because, right, like it was this class assignment, right? I couldn't not do it, to not do it. Well, I should say initially I couldn't do it. And my teacher, to be a Black girl in the South in public education, and particularly this was an advanced level class for fourth grade. So I was the only Black kid in this class, right? So I'm the only Black kid that can't answer this question. Already there's the stigma of me being a Black kid who is now asking questions about how do I do this assignment. So already narratives about defiance, disrespect are starting to come up when I'm like, how do I do this thing? And the teacher says making African dolls, and it's not a country, so I can't, like, that's actually not the answer to your assignment either.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I just, so I did the assignment because I didn't want to.
You just want to go to college.
Right, you know, like I wanted to move past that moment, but it has imprinted on me for everything that I do as a storyteller.
And so in this story, I don't know if that part happened, but you pick up, listen and tell these stories because that's the gift that's gonna keep giving. You really did take that and that's you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, like, it's very easy to conflate me with Mika. We're the same age. We, you know, chart the same timeline in the 90s. There are things that Mika experienced that I experienced. But I want to be like, this is not.
It's fiction.
Yeah, it's fiction. You know, and the way that I sort of talk about the differences, because people are like, why didn't you just write a memoir? And I was like, well, like memoir is interested, you know, this is Sophia's, but memoir is interested in accuracy, right? Like who said what, who did what, when this happened. Fiction is after a truth. I wanted to tell a truth about a Southern Black family in the suburbs in the 90s, right? So there were actual like real things and real time markers, but I didn't want to be trapped back. One, I can never get all the accurate answers. There are people that I write about in this book that weren't alive before I was born, that, you know, weren't alive at the time of me writing. And so there would be no way for me to sort of seek that accuracy. And so I made the decision to write a truthful story in fiction about a Black Southern family.
So you start with a story in the middle of the book, though, like, you know, this one that sort of sparked everything. And then you mentioned vignettes. So are you just writing bits and pieces and decide how it's going to fit in? Tell us a little bit about your process.
Yeah, so my process. So I think it is informed by my background as a poet, which is someone who is very interested in imagery, beautiful language. I am very narrative already in my poetry, so I'm interested in a story through poetry. Poetry gives us leaps and bounds that an associative language. Fiction wants us to sort of sew those things together. But short fiction, the short story, I believe, is like a perfect meld of the two, right? You get a moment in time, you have space for leaps and bounds. And then my like turning into bigger fiction project, the novel and stories, is the loosely sewing those images together. So the process of doing this book felt not far from the process of me putting a poetry collection together. I just had more room for the things that I wanted to write about in each chapter, vignette, story. I'm agnostic on how we call it.
What's the hardest part for you? If you have a background in poetry, was it a difference to change that into to do the weaving part or to do the short story?
So I've always been writing across genres.
Okay.
Always. My mother kept, when I was in elementary school, they had in the back corner of the library, P.S. Love libraries. There's scenes in here where Mika's visiting her library, the Richland County Public Library. But in the back corner of her school library was this room where I and Mika could take well, this is me actually telling the story. Mika didn't experience this in this book. Where I could take my manuscripts, the stories that I wrote, starting from kindergarten, and the librarian would staple them together. It was like
You're on printing press kind of?
it was like they would staple them together and you could pick out your cover, which is really just wrapping paper. And then, she'd call your home office and when it was ready to be picked up. And I did 10 of them over my elementary school career. And it is in both poetry and prose. And so I say, like, I've always written both genres. I think how, the public experiences me as a storyteller is really a conversation around the publishing process.
Okay.
And how one might have ease of access to publishing poetry before kind of the hoops and everything with fiction. So I don't think of like there being a shift in my brain, maybe a shift in attention. I have not been writing as much poetry while I was working on this, and now I'm working on my second book of fiction. But largely how I approach the page is the same. It's about, but if I decide if I want to do a poem or fiction, it's about how much room do I need for this thing that I'm after.
There's a little bit of poetry in this one. Tommy Major gives some poem, like when he was a younger person. Why did you decide to put that in there? I like it.
So that is an homage to my father, who
Okay.
passed away in the middle of this book. In the middle of me writing this book. So Tommy is like the avatar to my father, who, as best as he possibly could, he's an engineer, a satellite engineer for PBS for 30 years, self-taught. And when he saw, and then, you know, pass it on to me. So in one part of my brain, I can do very high level mathematical scientific things. And then the other side of my brain, I'm very much like interested in creative writing. And when he saw like my leaning more towards creative writing and storytelling, he was like, well, like maybe you shouldn't choose a career that is based on the subjectivity. It's like, I'm hard-headed. So you probably should have said the other way. Maybe you shouldn't do engineering, and then I'm gonna
Reverse psychology.
But you know, like, but here he was, and before I was even born, when we were living wherever we were, and we didn't have a washer and dryer in the house, we'd go to the laundromat in the middle of the night after his third job and write poems. And, you know, before he died, he had said that he had showed me his whole archive of poetry from like 1976 to 1980. And I had to put it in.
So that's it. That's
his poetry.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh, how beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, that means even more now. That's wonderful though. And do you have all those now? I mean,
Yeah.
oh, what a gift.
Yeah.
Y'all, that's a surprise. Reveal. I'm kind of just watch, okay, I'm gonna change this a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Because there's this theme of you need to know where you're from before you know where you're going. Do you agree with that statement?
I think one needs to be settled in a thing.
Okay.
And my phrase, you send an institution of American slavery, I will never know. There's just being that I will absolutely never know. Sure, there's technologies to get us to potentially a country, something, but it's just that line is forever severed. And for a long time, stemming from fourth grade, like that was a point of contention for me, of that not knowing. And I had a chance when I was in New York. I feel like when I went to New York, I have never felt more Black American being in New York City than when I was in the South. Because there were stratospheres of Blackness that I just hadn't come across growing up. And that increased my anxiety about not knowing, right? There's the Caribbean Day Parade, there's, you know, all of these African Day Parades, and then there is an African American Day Parade, but it just always urged me that like there was this thing that I could never reach. And eventually my like settling came from, you know, not being invested in jumping over the Atlantic Ocean, but being invested in the story of my family starting here. And like, so that's kind of like where I start my story of where I come from. And that is very important to me. And so like the search for where you're coming from, again, needs to be settled in the thing, right? So I have to be settled
To know that.
that
Roots are here, yeah.
right, like that's where I'm choosing to start that journey of of my peoples.
And has that given you peace?
It has, and it's given me, you know, like pride, right? Like to understand as a historian, right? So that's my academic background, to understand that like all of the shit, excuse me, all of the things that folks who built this country had to go through for me to be here telling you about them is remarkable to me.
I mean, it really is a phenomenal turn that you now have this grounding that you can build off of. So how do you go about researching a book like this that doesn't necessarily, I mean, you want to build the truth, but you also want to, you know, have this creative freedom. But I'm assuming you had to do some family research to feel comfortable with the past.
Yeah, I mean, so, which is why, you know, the book starts with timelines of birth dates. And again, like, for me, my research as a historian was what was happening in the first 10 years of my grandmother's life being in Thompson, Georgia, right? Like, and this is the period of the early 1900s, this is the period of the Great Migration. The national narrative is that Blacks are fleeing the South and going to the Northeast, the West, the Midwest. But my family didn't, but my family did do a migration, right? The migration was from rural to suburban or to city, like for what they expect. But they thought it was, you know, like, and so, you know, and entering into the archive, like I believe this is my enter into the archive, the lived experiences of Black Southern folks. And so entering into that conversation is, and my grandfather did that too, Green Sea, South Carolina, which is near Myrtle Beach in Horry County, right? Like he went from tobacco fields to Columbia.
But that's
and that is
marriage, yeah.
But that's not the large narrative of movements of Blacks in the early 20th century, right? And so that was both things that I knew, like I knew my grandmother was born in Georgia, and I knew like she met my grandfather in Columbia. There's a large swath of what, you know, I didn't know in between and didn't have anyone to ask about. And so that was sort of where I fill in the truths, doing research and thinking about what's happening in the South of the country, right? Rena,
you have the wars as well that you have to.
right, exactly. Yeah. And the wars do bring Black folks, but they came before that. They came before World War II. But that gave Black folks industry, right? In some ways, out of necessity. But I'm thinking of also Rena, who's Mika's mother. She has a young unplanned pregnancy. I just don't believe that there's one person here. Like there's not that there's no plot, but the story, the narrative driver is time.
Yes.
And it's not that like the family is trying to solve a big thing. So Rena has an unplanned early pregnancy, and it happens to be in the early 70s, if you do the math of when it happens, when she was born. And there's this moment when she's in a doctor's office with her mother, who has just now found out. She tries to hide it. Rena tries to hide it from Weezy. And, you know, the doctors are basically like, well, she has to carry it to term. And then after she carries it to term, we can fix it. So that's a conversation around the sterilization of Black women in the South, right? That's a conversation around access to abortive care. Before Roe v. versus Wade. And so like really trying to track American history and culture along this Black family.
So that fits with Rena's timeline. Yeah, that was a very powerful, especially right now with what's going on. 13, she's 13 years old. So it's a very powerful spot in the book that sort of takes your breath, but you don't stay in these chapters for too long. You do tend to switch. Why do you do that?
That is my poet in me.
Okay.
The leaps that I get to make. And like the focus wasn't on that, right? Like
right. She moves, like her life moves.
Yeah, and Weezy, you know, even in that moment is just like, it doesn't matter how we got here. it's what we do now after it. And I think that like, for Black contemporary literature, a lot of it, there's an expectation that we wallow and stay in those pain points in the stories. And we as authors, the story stays there. And I'm just not interested in writing that story, right? Like that, like, but again.
Lisa gives her that light right in that moment, like, this is not gonna define you, you're gonna go on, you know what I mean? Like, she pulls that out of her immediately, like, we're moving forward. It was a really, like I said, powerful story. I wanna talk about Redwood Court though, because it's a very special place. Is that a real place to you? Okay, so a lot of the book revolves around the street, and it's a very special place. It's almost a utopia in a sort of a way. Cul-de-sac. And so talk about why you needed it to be set here.
Why I needed it to be set here. So again, back to kind of like expectations of Black contemporary literature, right? And the moment that I'm writing in. One is that the Black stories are generally in known places, which are generally urban, right? And even if they are located in the South, it is your known
Atlanta or, big,
Memphis, all things. And then there's the sort of other end of the spectrum, which is your rural. And generally, if it is a Black contemporary fiction set in the South, and rural neighborhoods, they're made up. They're not real places. I love Randall Keaton, I get to work with him, right, like, it was based off of where he was from, but he made it fictionalized. And for me, right, so there's this big gap of like, what about the Black folks who lived in like suburbia? Like what we might think of as suburbia, right? It's not white picket fences and all those things, but it's not the tobacco fields of my grandfather's upbringing, and it's not, you know? And so I was looking for that. And then my argument is that, and this is my historian self coming back to play, the further back in history I went as a student of history, the more we stopped relying on primary documents, and it was the culture of the people that sort of told the narrative of where they live, right? So I'm talking about the Near East cities. We're looking at the goddess faces and figurines, the Messiahs, the cave drawings, right? Like in the before actual what we consider primary documents. And so for me, I was like, in a future when I am the past, when this is the past, I really wanted there to be, if someone was to turn to culture, be like, what was it like to be Black and Southern and then into the 20th century? I wanted there to be a real place, right? Represented that this is it. And then in a larger sense, like Columbia, for so many people, and this is like my New York influence, but for so many people is so unknown that I didn't even make it up. I like absolutely didn't need to make it. You know, like I just didn't need to make Columbia up. And so when I think about like when I'm interested in developing that truth and filling in the fiction and the space between, I look for really hard anchors. So one of my really hard anchors was time and location. And you know, for my grandparents, when they made their migration to Columbia, like their American dream was to own their own house. And at that time in Columbia, they were developing specific parts of Black only neighborhoods for ownership. And so Redwood Court exists in San Fernando Castle. And that is where both of my grandparents lived out their lives. Let's say about that house. And I just felt like I didn't need to make it up.
It seems so personal. That's why I thought, I wonder if it really is. I want to talk about this cover because I love it. It's absolutely fascinating. Did you have any say in this?
I did.
Okay, I wanna hear all about it, because it's just, it's a collage, I mean, there's so much happening.
Yeah.
So tell us about this, because,
So I got really lucky with my publisher and they allowed me to have input. And part of the input was like, tell us some of your favorite book covers, right? Like both comp titles, like comparative titles to your work and, and just like what you really
yeah,
like, just
just
whether
your design stuff.
yeah. And when I thought about all of the Black contemporary literary works that I really loved, one of the things, like, there was a type, and it was abstract art, big letters, or a single figure, regardless of the title of the book. And I use the short story collection, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, plural, and there's one woman.
And you're like, but it's plural.
Right. But like, and so, you know, you can go into the library and like look for Black books, and you can go to the bookstore, look for Black books, and like, it is very often one of those two things.
Okay.
And so I knew I didn't want that, and to reiterate the intergenerational narrative, like piece of it. And so they, my press hired an artist, Equa Holmes, who does beautiful work on so many different book covers. And she, you know, sending back and forth some first drafts of it, what she thought. And this is where, like, because of my writing process, I did so much character development, both on like the family members that I knew and like as I was developing them into their own characters. But I used for my editor and for me pictures of my family to be like, that's this person, that's the that. So then when I'm getting the artistic renditions of these characters, I'm like, that is not what they look like.
Recast.
No, they had Tina looking like MLK. I was like, no. Like she no fault of her. She didn't give no. I just like, okay, maybe I do like, maybe I do have feelings about what they should look like. And so she had asked, are there any pictures that I can like go off of? And so the press sent her the photos that we had already been circulating amongst each other as we were talking about the book during editing. And I just assumed that that was what she's gonna use to continue to draw the images out. And so it was actually a surprise to me that she actually used the archival photos on the cover. But it also just like continues to help my little historian self of like my mission being to enter into the archive, right? Like everyday Black folks, right? And like my family gets like slipped into this archive.
Yeah, and it's a fictional time capsule.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's so close, it's just on the brink
Mm-hmm.
of all of, what does your family think about this? Have they
So
read
many
it?
of them are gone. Oh, yeah, so many of them are gone.
How are you handling that?
This is my work for that, for honoring them. And to make sure that folks know that we were here.
You did it beautifully. It really is a fantastic novel.